The dilemma posed in today's gospel is often misinterpreted. It is frequently brought forward as Jesus saying, keep church and state separated. But Jesus, the law, and the prophets are filled with political messages. Scriptures tell us how to live as a holy people in communion with a loving God and one another in the midst of a sinful world filled with hatred and divisiveness. Living into this contradiction cannot help but be political. Jesus did not preach keeping church and state separate, as we so often understand it, but rather to live life deliberately. The people who posed this conundrum to Jesus, likely not Pharisees, as they frequently were asked similar questions themselves and answered very much like Jesus. Those people were trying to either trick him into openly preaching rebellion or to show himself as being a collaborator. But the answer Jesus gives, and one that some of the Pharisees also are recorded as having given, was that paying taxes was a matter of life in that time and place. Was it fair? Of course not. Slaves were made to pay the same tax from their meager earnings that they had built up over the year as an attempt to buy their freedom. Men, women, and children, rich and poor, slave and free, all paid the same exact tax of 1 denarii. What was for one a pittance was for another the difference between eating and starving that day. But not paying the tax just meant death on political grounds and deaths of innocents who would be swept up in collective punishment that would follow. Refusing to pay the tax would not end the subjugation of the Jewish people, and it would not result in a progressive restructuring of the tax system. It would make the lives of the Jewish people, and especially the poorest and most vulnerable among them, harder. Jesus and the scriptures also do not exactly endorse the occupation and the empire either. Ultimately, it was the empire that crucified Jesus. Peter and Paul were executed at the behest of the Emperor Nero. And the entirety of the book of Revelation is a poorly veiled polemic against the empire as the work of the devil. So to be clear, Jesus was not endorsing the Roman Empire's occupation and institution of a regressive tax system upon the conquered people of Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. But he was also not endorsing staging a doomed political revolt that would result in only more suffering. Rather, he asked for a coin that everyone in his audience had in their pockets, and a coin that has any number of blasphemies on it, referring to the emperor as a god, and a coin that the people used to pay one another, because except when it came to tax time, no one wanted to start bloodshed over currency. It is through the coin itself that Jesus makes his point. It is not ultimately the tax at issue. It is the occupation. But that is not changing through civil disobedience or even violence. So instead, stop worrying about things you cannot change. Make the change that you can and find joy in the life that you have and bring joy to others. Now, Marie, Jane, and Peggy and I spent yesterday and Friday at the Diocesan Convention, and the notion of joy and thankfulness in the midst of suffering and horror was the theme drawing on last week's reading from Philippians. Now, this theme was chosen weeks, if not months ago. But with the war in Israel and Palestine and the violence spilling over around the world, as we struggle to condemn both the Hamas murderous terrorist attack on civilians, including children in Israel, and the bombing and cutting off of food and water to millions of innocent civilians, including more children in Palestine, to find the middle path of peace, rejecting both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, to say that pregnant women, the elderly, children, and those who care for them should not be murdered for the actions of politicians and zealots, and with Reverend Earl King trying to pitch a 2024 pilgrimage to the Holy Land from the hallway, the notion of finding thankfulness and joy in this moment seemed all the more poignant and impossible. But that is what we find in the scriptures and in today's gospel. Not a denial of the inhumanity of the occupation and suffering of the people, but a turning towards doing God's work on earth, on giving the emperor the coins that bear his likeness, but giving to God that which bears God's image, our very selves. Not surrendering to helplessness or despair, but choosing joy, choosing thankfulness, choosing love. Not because of suffering or in denial of suffering, but in the midst of suffering, as the ultimate act of defiance against the evils of this world. Choosing to find the humanity in the midst of inhumanity and to live it out. Choosing to love our neighbor, whatever their ancestry, legal status, religion, abilities, disabilities, language, criminal records, skin color, sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status, and even when they hate us. Choosing joy, choosing thankfulness, we are choosing love. And we are choosing God. We are choosing to be voices crying out in the midst of the wilderness of a world filled with selfishness, hatred, and despair, calling people to return home, to be the beloved community we are all meant to be. We are choosing to be the image of God. Amen.